Thanks so much for joining us. We are talking with Ann Gardner Perkins. Thank you so much for being on, who's the author of this book, Yale Needs More Women. And there's a tagline, how the first group of girls rewrote the rules of an Ivy League giant, Yale. 1969, women show up. There are 575 of them. Why did you write this book? You were in the class of 1977, so you followed them, but why did you write this book?
I guess a couple of reasons, and you know, the first one was I got interested in this story because I didn't know anything about these women when I was at Yale. No one talked about them, and I went back to school to get my...
No one talked about them? It was an international story in 1969.
Yeah, but I was there 8 years later,
yeah.
And it was as if they were invisible. Perhaps it's a history Yale wasn't proud of, I don't know, but it was not something we talked about at all. And so I got curious about it about 7 years ago, but when I looked at the research that had been done, all the books that had been written to date wrote about coeducation without actually talking to the women.
How do you do that?
I don't know. And so that's the point when I just thought, all right, you know, this is not a story that I'm going to let go by. You know, I was just so upset that these women had been made invisible, and it seemed like I could do something about that.
In 1977, when you got to Yale, 8 years after the first class went through,
yeah,
was it still very difficult? I would imagine it was.
Well, Yale starts by having a quota on the number of women. So when we hear Yale went co-ed, we think it looks like it does now. But initially, women were just 13% of the student body. By the time I get there, they've lifted that quota. So the student body was 40% women in my class. So the numbers of women students seem a little better, but it was still a very male place. I only had 2 women professors my entire time there, and you know, the student organizations, it was really my class that was finally moving into leadership roles. All the photos on the portraits on the wall were men. It was a very male place.
Now you went on to Harvard, you're a Rhodes Scholar, English is your thing. How did that shape you as a young woman going to Yale?
I think it made me tougher, you know. I think it just made me a little bit tougher with both good and bad sides of that, you know. I would say.
Going forward, you came from Baltimore. Did you apply to all Ivy Leagues and you got into Yale, or what were you thinking as an 18-year-old woman where you wanted to head?
I was thinking I want to go to one of the 2 best schools in the country, and I knew that they hadn't let women in before. I knew I wasn't able to go when I was in elementary school, so I applied to Yale and Harvard, and I got into both, and I picked Yale.
And then you end up at Harvard at some point anyway.
Yes.
And then the Rhodes Scholar. So good for you.
Yeah.
All right, so we want to talk about this book and some of the things that happened to this first class in 1969. And what better way to do that than to show some of the folks who were in that class. So let's go down these memory lane.
Okay.
Who is this? What did she tell you about her experience in 1969?
So this is Shirley Daniels. She grew up in Roxbury, which is the Harlem of Boston. And like about half of those first women students, she comes into Yale that first year as a transfer student. So half of the women came in straight from high school, and half had not been allowed to apply to Yale when they were high school seniors, and Yale let them in as transfers. So she was in a college in Simmons College in Boston, heard that Yale had an Afro-American Studies program. It was one of the only ones in the nation, and so she sent in her application, and as she told me, she wrote with her whole heart why she wanted to study Afro-American Studies at Yale, and they accepted her.
Now, was she instrumental in getting this going, furthering African-American studies, I would imagine, at Yale?
So that was the very first year of that. Shirley is very active in helping get more black students at Yale. So I don't know if you've heard of Skip Gates.
Sure.
So Skip, he started at Yale in 1969 as well, and what he says is it was the blackest class in that, you know, that Ivy League school had ever seen, but there's still only 92 African-American freshmen, men and women, coming in that first year. So So it's the black students who are active in recruiting in cities all over the country to bring in more students, and then to tutor those students when they come to help it so that they succeed at Yale. And Shirley was in charge of that.
This was an interesting time in New Haven and at Yale.
Yeah.
There were protests about the Vietnam War. There were rallies concerning the Black Panthers. It was a tough time in America. So that, with the women paving ways, a lot of tumultuous stuff going on, I would think, in that class.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for the African American women, so just to give you the overall picture, women as a whole are 13% of the student body that first year. African American women are 1% of the student body. There's only 40 of them, and in Shirley's class there's only 8 African American women. One of them spoke at a panel I moderated at Yale on Saturday, and she talked about how they ended up being sort of the fulcrum between the community, the black community in New Haven, and the college. So the community saw them as representing Yale, and Yale saw them as representing the community. And it was both a powerful and a difficult spot to be in.
Interesting. And it's only been 50 years since women have been, that doesn't seem like that long.
Well, one of my son's college roommates has been helping me with social media. I'm very new to that. And told me he was talking to his friends at work and telling him about this, and they said, 1869, right?
You would think, right?
Right.
Oh,
and so
we have so much work to be done.
Yeah.
All right, here's another student that you talked to. Who is this?
This is Kit McClure. So Kit grows up in a suburb of Newark, and her parents are very liberal on matters of race. They're active in civil rights. But when Kit, who's a sort of a musical prodigy, she's been performing piano since she was a young girl, tells them she wants to play trombone, they say, no, that's a boy's instrument. You may not play trombone.
And so she did it anyway?
She talks the band leader into letting her stay at school and play around in the band room after school, and by the time her parents figure out what she's done, she's taught herself how to play trombone.
What did she go on to do in her life?
Okay, so she comes to Yale with this dream of starting an all-women's rock band. And at this time, rock bands are 5 guys in instruments, 6 guys in instruments. I mean, think the Beatles, Three Dog Night,
Rolling Stones, right?
Rolling Stones. She ends up graduating Yale with a music major, is part of the New Haven Women's Liberation Rock Band, an all-women rock band, and then she goes on to found the Kit McClure Band, which is an interracial, all-women's jazz band, and that's how she led her life.
And so there you go. The first gal we talked about, what did she do in her life?
Shirley she went to UVA Law School, was a corporate lawyer for a while, and then switched careers, and she's now a Baptist minister.
Wow.
Yeah.
So many facets, so little time.
Yeah.
All right, here's a picture of 2 gals playing sports, but in this class, there were no girls' sports back in 1969. They just made it up.
So Laurie Mifflin is the one that the book follows. She's the shorter one of the 2, and this is their senior year. But when Laurie comes to Yale from Philadelphia, which is a big sports town, she's been playing field hockey at her public high school her entire time there, and actually since she's 11. And she shows up at the athletic office, asks where to sign up for sports, and they tell her there aren't any competitive sports for women. And so she and her friend Jane Curtis, they organize some makeshift practices, but then that summer they write surrounding colleges in the area announcing that Yale has a field hockey team and asking them if they'd like to play. When the colleges agree to play, they go to the athletic office and say, all right, we've got a schedule, will you please give us a field?
And that was just 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Was Yale, when they allowed women to be on their campus, they were not ready physically for this. They didn't have the infrastructure to handle women. I would think restrooms and women's sports and all of that. How difficult was that?
You know, the women talk about, the bathroom seems like a silly thing.
No.
But they would finish a class and then have to run back to their dorm where there was a women's bathroom, go to the bathroom, and then run back to class because there weren't women's bathrooms in the buildings. Yale gave itself 10 months to transform from an institution that had been men only for 268 years to a co-ed institution, and understandably things did not change quickly enough.
Boy, no kidding.
Yeah.
All right, let's look at another student.
This is Connie Royster. So Connie grew up in New Haven, and she had been around Yale as a young girl because her extended family, her grandfather and older cousins, worked as stewards and chefs and managers serving the young men in Yale's fraternities and secret societies. And then she gets into Yale. But Connie's family is interesting. Her grandmother helped found the NAACP here in New Haven. She's named for her aunt, Constance Baker Motley, who was the first African-American woman to be appointed as a federal judge. So she has a long and proud tradition here in New Haven, and she's the first one of her grandfather's kids to get into Yale.
How did you go about selecting the people you were going to interview?
I started initially by doing, I did 42 interviews of these first women, and what I was looking for is women who were even at the edge of women at Yale in some way, because there's a lot of literature showing that those are the women who can maybe see more of the changes that need to be made. So I was focusing on women who were active in a group called the Sisterhood, which was the first women's group, women who were active in sports, which was so cutting edge, strangely, for women at the time, and African-American women. And then of those that I interviewed, there were a number. I wanted interconnected stories, and you know, you mentioned you have 3 daughters, I have 1, and I wanted a book she would really want to read, so that's why I focused on the story of these 5 women, because I wanted her to know them and care about them and be inspired about them.
And this is your first book? This
is my first book.
How's reaction? I mean, you're just now starting to tour. How's the reaction?
You know, what I love is, so I was in Southern Pines, North Carolina at the start of this week, and it was a bookstore, an indie bookstore, filled with people who had no connection with Yale. And they're so inspired by these women and what they did and didn't know this story. And what I love in particular are the 20-year-olds, the 18-year-olds, the 30-year-olds who are inspired by these women. And that's what I'm hearing.
And perhaps this will be a movie.
That would be fun.
Get the rights to it.
Yeah.
All right. The next photo that we have.
That's Betty Spawn. So Betty grows up in the Midwest. Her family does not want her to go to Yale. They don't trust Easterners. They don't think their values are good. They don't know why the University of Illinois isn't good enough for Betty, but she's determined to come here. And while they help her pay her tuition initially, she's got younger brothers coming along. They don't have enough money to foot the bill for Yale. And so she ends up having to work in the New Haven post office, the night shift, to pay for her tuition. So she starts at midnight, works till 8 a.m., comes back to campus, naps, goes to classes, and then goes back again at midnight so that she can stay at Yale and graduate.
And what did she end up doing in her life?
So Betty became a lawyer and a law professor. And she lived in Boston and taught students who were like her, not the wealthy of the wealthy, that she encountered among some people at Yale, but working class kids who were trying to make it up to the next level by becoming lawyers.
And so many kids are on scholarship at Yale. I don't think people realize that. All right, next individual.
So this is Elga Wasserman. So when Yale goes co-ed, of the top 54 administrators in the university, only 1 is a woman. And so they decide, well, maybe we should hire a woman to help lead the transition to co-education. And Elga Wasserman is the woman that they pick. So she's the first person ever to work in the president's office at Yale who's not a secretary.
And what did she do to advance women at Yale?
You know, she had a pretty impossible position. Because if she didn't push hard, Yale really wasn't inclined to change very much. Nothing would have happened. And because she did push a little bit, she gets branded as pushing, you know, too pushy.
Well, there you go, too pushy. But,
right.
A man would not be called that at all.
Right, but she's wonderful. So they don't give her a budget at all. All she has is a student intern and a secretary. So she goes to a woman trustee of Radcliffe and asks her for a grant because there's things she wants to do. I mean, there's no career advising for women. There's no directory of services for women. And she gets the grant from this wealthy woman trustee of Radcliffe, and Yale is furious. They say, she should have given the money to us, not to you. But she's feisty like that, and she does that type of thing again and again and again to help women, you know, these young women.
Well, hats off to her.
Yeah.
Next picture is Yale president Kingman Brewster.
Yeah.
Now, he has an interesting story, right? Did he want women to come in?
No. So Brewster's very insular. Think of it. He went to an all-boys prep school, then he went to all-male Yale. He ends up as the president of Yale and appoints the best people to advise him, who are men who, like him, went to all-male Yale, and his wife is the daughter of a Yale man. So he really doesn't see women as equals at all. And
how unfortunate for him.
Yes. Yes. I mean, this is the part I love. So he doesn't think women are leaders, but if he had looked out his office window, Janet Yellen, the first woman Federal Reserve Board chair, is at Yale Graduate School studying economics. Hillary Rodham is just starting at the law school, where Marion Wright Edelman had already graduated. There were plenty of women leaders at Yale. He just wasn't able to see it.
And so it happened despite him not wanting it to happen at Yale.
What ended up happening was, for marketing reasons, Yale had to accept women, because what the memos he kept getting, increasingly frantic, from the admissions office was the number of guys who are turning down Yale to go to Harvard is increasing, and when we asked them why, it's because they can date women at Harvard who go to Radcliffe or nearby Wellesley, whereas Yale men have to travel to Vassar or Mount Holyoke to get an appropriate date.
So was Harvard the first Ivy League to allow women in? Do you know?
I do know, and it was not Harvard. It was Cornell.
Cornell.
So Cornell was co-ed from the start, but like many colleges, they depressed the number of women, in their case, by saying all freshmen have to live in dormitories on campus, and then they didn't build enough women's dorms. So Cornell is still only 30% women.
They set you up to fail, right?
Yeah.
All right. What is this sign? This is welcoming guys and dolls of 73. So this is past 69, and it's Yale University Police. That's
okay,
interesting.
so it's so the guys and dolls of 73 were the freshmen who arrived in 69. So this is
right, correct.
Yes, yes. So this is actually the very first women freshmen arriving in Vanderbilt Hall at the end of Yale's campus. So they put the freshmen together, and one of them said to me, I didn't really realize how outnumbered I'd be until I looked out and I saw the entire old campus, and ours was the only dorm with women. All the rest were filled by men. And
this class of 69 was under the microscope. The New York Times ran a story. I mean, it had to be an international story. Here comes these women, and they had to deal with that too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, particularly in that first couple of months. I mean, it's almost like there's a news person and a camera person in their face every single day asking them this question, what's it like to be a Yale woman? Well, how do you answer that when you're 17?
And so here's a picture of this.
Yeah.
Describe this to me. This is the old campus, yes?
Yes, so this is the old campus. This young woman has just registered as a student at Yale, and she walks out, and there's a cameraman asking her opinion of what it's like to be a Yale woman and how it feels to be a Yale woman, and she's only been there about 5 hours.
That actually might be Bob Norman from our television station years and years ago, though I can't quite see, but it may be.
Oh, that's
since
very funny.
Since we're so close. Here we have a woman walking alone on campus.
And, you know, I find this picture sad, but I also love it because, as you said, there's 575 of these women, but they're spread out over Yale's 12 residential colleges. Most of them never meet each other their entire time there. And one of them turned to me this weekend. She had read that book, and she teared up and she said, I never realized that other women were lonely, too.
Oh my gosh.
And so it's a very lonely experience for many of them because they don't know many other women at all.
But they were pioneers for what's to come.
They are.
Slowly it, came about, but they're pioneers.
Yeah.
Is this a law class that we're looking at? What exactly is going on here?
In the very first year of coeducation, in February, some of the activist women at the Yale Law School and Graduate School have something called the Free Women Conference. And so the young woman on the far side there is Kit McClure, the saxophone player, before she's cut her hair. But also there is Kate Millett, who ends up writing Sexual Politics, which becomes a big book of second-wave feminism. And so this is part of the Free Women Conference to just start this idea of getting people at Yale to understand what the women's liberation movement is.
Well, there was no template. They had to make it up as they went.
Absolutely.
Here's an old-fashioned phone and a towel, and a Yale towel. What's happening here?
Okay, so this was a feature, part of a feature that Look magazine did on Yale women, and they had this young woman, she's a freshman, pose with this Yale towel around her and her hair in curlers. And
because that's all they ever did.
Right.
Just
and
curl
talk
their
on the
hair
phone.
and talked on the phone.
Yes. Yeah.
How perfect. All right, so this must be one of the protests going on?
Yeah, so in May, at the end of the first year of coeducation, there's a trial in New Haven of a group of Black Panthers, including Bobby Seale and Erica Huggins. Erica Huggins is the New Haven Black Panther leader. Yale closes down because 50,000 protesters are expected to come. But the young women are very active in being peace marshals and trying to help keep the peace. And they've often been left out of this story. It's often told as a story of men, but the women students were incredibly active, and the National Guard comes in. That's what you're seeing in that photo.
It reminds me of when we talk about war, and you think of men, but all the women that helped in the war effort as well.
Absolutely.
Here's a Volkswagen Beetle, one of my favorite cars.
Yes.
What's going on here?
All right, so that's the New Haven Women's Liberation Rock Band, and Kit McClure, which is just unheard of, just to see women who are playing. And I mean, they're very funny. The collection of instruments includes sort of tambourine and saxophone, but this is them in Virginia Blaisdell's VW Beetle, which they used to use to get around with.
I love it.
Yeah.
And then finally we see some sports going on with women.
Yes. And I love the car in the background here, because I told you, they browbeat Yale into giving them a field. Well, the field that they're given is the field that they use as a parking lot for the football games. So on the days that they practice after there's been a football game, they have to begin practice by picking up the beer cans and the charcoal briquettes and all of the other debris that's been left on their field that Yale has given them to practice on.
How did their male colleagues, freshmen, sophomore, junior, and seniors, in that first class look upon women? This was just a field to date. These were just women you would date. What did they tell you about that? Did they look at them as an equal at all? What was going on campus?
They will often distinguish between the guys who come in as freshmen to a technically co-ed Yale, who were sort of as befuddled as they were and thinking they were going to a co-ed school, and particularly the seniors, the male seniors who'd been at an all-male Yale and applied to an all-male Yale, were a little more hostile to them, and they'll describe knowing a Yale senior who would just X off every freshman girl he'd slept with, and would target them that way. There's a wide range of them. Many of the young men are allies to the women and help fight and push Yale to end this quota on the number of women. The male students are really one of the major reasons Brewster finally gives in, but there are others who see women as targets and treat them accordingly.
Did you just scratch the surface with this? Are there more books to come about Yale or Harvard, or is this a one-off and it's all in here as much as you could tell?
I think that captures this story. I mean, there's so many other stories about women who've been forgotten to write. But I think this captures the Yale story.
So you're going to do a tour of this. Is there another book in Anne Gardner Perkins?
I hope so, but I don't know what it is yet. I wish I could tell you.
On your tour across the country, you might figure that out.
Yeah, that's what I'm hoping.
Did you enjoy it? Or I wrote much smaller books, but it was like they're your baby. Once you do that, you're so protective, and oh my gosh. But once you see this come in a box and you see the actual cover that you did this, wasn't that joy?
Well, you know what's the real joy is seeing the women touch this and see them see their story in print. That's what really matters, and that's really what's been fun. Yeah.
Well, Anne, enjoy the ride, enjoy the tale, the stories, all the places you're going to be, and thanks for telling their story.
Well, Anne, thank you for inviting me in. I really appreciate it, and I'm a big admirer of yours, and so it's just great to be here.
You betcha. It's all about girls. We'll stick together.
Okay.
Thanks, Anne.
Thank you.
Spend all night kissing and the bumper's right here, then who else is missing? Got a little sidetracked to find us a wishing to find the keys to the door, but it's also a metaphor. Things keep locked in the grocery store, but mine just to save time. Skip right ahead to the nice ride.